Look out! I've got you!
Diving across polished marble, arms outstretched toward a small figure in a bright yellow dress. The corporate executives watched in stunned silence as debris crashed where the child had stood just milliseconds earlier. "Please spare me." The janitor's voice cracked as he clutched the little girl to his chest, eyes squeezed shut. He wasn't begging the CEO standing frozen nearby, he was pleading with fate itself. If you're just joining us on this incredible journey, hit that like button and subscribe now, because this story of courage, second chances, and redemption is one you'll want to share with everyone you know. Sometimes the most extraordinary heroes wear the most ordinary clothes. Hashtag the man behind the uniform. Ray Mercer hadn't always pushed a mop for a living. At 36, his calloused hands told the story of a life derailed by circumstance rather than choice. 5 years earlier, he'd been wearing tailored suits and leading a team of software engineers at a promising startup. His wife Elaine had been his high school sweetheart, his business partner, and the mother of their daughter, Sophie. The morning everything changed had begun like any other. Ray had kissed Elaine goodbye as she left for a client meeting across town. "Don't forget Sophie's recital tonight," she'd reminded him, adjusting his tie with practiced affection. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," he'd promised. 3 hours later, a police officer stood at his office door. Drunk driver. Head-on collision. No survivors. The officer's words blurred together as Ray's world imploded. In the weeks that followed, grief consumed him. The startup faltered without Elaine's financial expertise. Investors pulled out. Ray barely noticed as everything they'd built together crumbled around him. His sole focus became 4-year-old Sophie, who kept asking when mommy was coming home. When the bank foreclosed on their home, Ray packed what remained of their life into his car and drove to his childhood hometown. There, in a small apartment that smelled of other people's cooking, he tried to rebuild their lives from scratch. The best job he could find was night janitor at Paragon Industries, a sprawling corporate headquarters where executives earned in an hour what he made in a week. During the day, he took odd programming jobs when he could get them, working from the community library while Sophie attended the public preschool he could barely afford. Every night, after tucking Sophie into bed at his elderly neighbor's apartment, Ray donned his gray uniform and swept the floors where important people made important decisions. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd once been on a similar trajectory, promising, ambitious, destined for success. Now he emptied their trash cans. Hashtag the CEO's golden cage. Victoria Harrington had everything Ray had lost: power, respect, wealth, and it brought her no joy. At 42, she'd reached the pinnacle of corporate achievement as CEO of Paragon Industries, a technology conglomerate she'd helped transform into a Fortune 100 company. Her corner office on the 38th floor offered panoramic views of the city skyline, but she rarely took time to appreciate them. Victoria's days were structured in 15-minute increments, each moment scheduled, optimized, and leveraged toward greater success. She hadn't taken a vacation in 7 years. The price of her ascension had been steep. 2 failed marriages. Estrangement from her parents, who didn't understand her ambition. No children, though her second husband had desperately wanted them. The board of directors had become her family, spreadsheets and quarterly projections her companions. Victoria's personal assistant, Marcus, managed her life with military precision. He scheduled her meals, chose her wardrobe, and maintained the carefully curated fiction that she had interests outside of work. The reality was Victoria lived in the office, sleeping on the designer sofa in her private lounge more often than in her penthouse apartment 20 minutes away. What the executive team didn't know, what Victoria had successfully hidden for nearly a year, was that Paragon Industries was in trouble. Their flagship product had critical security vulnerabilities that engineering couldn't resolve. A competitor was gaining market share with alarming speed. And there was a whisper campaign about a potential hostile takeover. Victoria needed a miracle, and she was running out of time to find one. Worlds on a collision course. The annual Bring Your Child to Work Day was a tradition Victoria secretly dreaded. The ordered efficiency of her corporate domain dissolved into chaos as employees' offspring ran through hallways, asked inappropriate questions, and touched everything with sticky fingers. This year was particularly challenging. The board meeting where she needed to present her strategy to save the company had been scheduled for the same day. Victoria had tried to have the children's event rescheduled, but the PR department had already sent out press releases highlighting Paragon's family-friendly policies. On the morning of the event, Ray faced his own crisis. His neighbor Mrs. Patel, who usually watched Sophie while he worked, had fallen and needed to see a doctor. The after-school program was closed for teacher training. Ray called every contact in his limited network, but found no one available to watch his daughter. "I'm sorry, Princess," he told Sophie over breakfast. "I think you'll have to come to work with Daddy tonight." The 6-year-old's eyes widened with excitement. "I can see where you work. The big building with all the windows?" Ray nodded, trying to match her enthusiasm while mentally calculating how he could keep her entertained for an 8-hour shift. He packed her backpack with coloring books, a tablet with educational games, and her favorite stuffed rabbit, Mr. Hoppy. "You'll need to be very quiet and stay where I put you, okay? Daddy could get in trouble if anyone knows you're there." Sophie nodded solemnly. She was used to rules meant to keep their precarious life from unraveling further. What Ray didn't know was that the 38th floor, normally the last on his cleaning route when the building was empty, would be bustling with activity that evening as Victoria's team prepared for their critical presentation. The Invisible Man. Ray had perfected the art of invisibility. He moved through the gleaming hallways of Paragon Industries like a ghost, eyes downcast, movements efficient. Most executives looked through him rather than at him. He'd learned their patterns, their habits, which offices could be cleaned while occupied and which executives preferred privacy. Victoria Harrington was firmly in the latter category. Ray had cleaned her office exactly twice in 5 years, both times when she was traveling. Otherwise, her assistant Marcus left a note instructing him to skip it. That evening, Ray settled Sophie in the janitorial supply closet on the 35th floor with her activities and a juice box. "I'll check on you every 20 minutes, he promised. "And you have my phone number memorized, right?" 5550187, Sophie recited dutifully. "But only for emergencies." "That's my smart girl." He kissed her forehead. "I'll be back before you know it." Ray worked methodically through his routine, hyper-aware of the time. Every 20 minutes, he returned to find Sophie coloring or playing quietly with Mr. Hoppy. Around 9 p.m., she began to droop with fatigue. "Just 2 more floors, Princess," Ray said. "Then we can go home." "Can I come with you?" Sophie asked, rubbing her eyes. "I promise I'll be quiet." Ray hesitated. The executive floors should be empty by now. Even workaholics usually went home by this hour. And carrying her sleeping form back to the supply closet later would be easier than leaving her alone when she was clearly tired. "Okay, but remember." "I know, Daddy." Super quiet, like a ninja. Hand in hand, they took the service elevator to the 38th floor. Ray was surprised to see lights still on in the conference room and Victoria Harrington's office. He decided to clean the opposite end of the floor first, hoping the late workers would leave soon. Sophie trailed behind him, wide-eyed at the opulent surroundings. The walls were adorned with expensive artwork, the floors covered with plush carpeting that muffled their footsteps. Through glass walls, they could see empty offices bigger than their entire apartment. "Do princesses work here?" Sophie whispered. Ray smiled. "Something like that." As they approached the conference room, Ray heard raised voices. He recognized Victoria Harrington's precise diction, though he'd only heard her speak a few times. "These projections are unacceptable, James. We need concrete solutions, not maybes and possibilities." We're working around the clock, Victoria. The engineering team. I don't want excuses. I want results. The board meeting is in 12 hours, and I refuse to walk in there without a solid plan. Ray steered Sophie away. Let's start at the other end, he whispered. They had nearly finished the floor when disaster struck. Sophie, fighting sleep and growing bored, wandered toward the elaborate architectural model displayed in the center of the open area near Victoria's office. The scale replica of Paragon's proposed new headquarters stood on a massive pedestal, a showpiece for investors and visiting dignitaries. Ray was emptying a trash can when he heard Sophie's delighted gasp. He turned to see her reaching for the miniature tree surrounding the model. Sophie, no, he began, but it was too late. Her small hand knocked against one of the support beams of the display. The model trembled. Ray lunged forward as the pedestal began to tip toward his daughter, 30 pounds of metal and glass about to crash down. ## the moment of truth. Time slowed to a crawl. Ray saw everything with crystalline clarity, Sophie's expression shifting from curiosity to fear, the massive display toppling in what seemed like slow motion, and beyond her, Victoria Harrington emerging from her office, frozen in shock at the unfolding scene. Ray didn't think, he reacted. He dove across the polished floor, arms outstretched, his body a shield. He collided with Sophie, wrapping her in his embrace as they slid across the marble. The crash behind them was deafening as the display shattered, pieces of metal and glass flying everywhere. Curled around his daughter, eyes squeezed shut, Ray whispered, "Please spare me." Not for himself, but for Sophie, a prayer that she wasn't hurt, that he hadn't failed to protect her as he'd failed in so many other ways. When he opened his eyes, Victoria Harrington stood over them, her expression unreadable. Behind her, Marcus and several other executives crowded the doorway, drawn by the commotion. "I'm so sorry," Ray stammered, still clutching Sophie. "It was an accident. I'll pay for the damages. Please, I can't lose this job." Victoria raised her hand, silencing him. For a long moment, she simply stared at the janitor and child huddled amidst the destruction of the display that had cost more than his annual salary. Then she did something that stunned everyone present. She knelt down beside them, designer suit and all. "Are you hurt?" she asked, addressing Sophie directly. The little girl shook her head, eyes wide with fear. Victoria turned to Ray. "That was remarkable. Your reflexes," she stopped, seeming to process something. "You're not supposed to have children here during work hours." Ray swallowed hard. "My childcare fell through. I had no other options. I'll accept whatever consequences." "What's your name?" Victoria interrupted. "Ray Mercer. I've been on the night cleaning crew for 5 years." Recognition flickered across Victoria's face. "Mercer, not Raymond Mercer who developed the secure payment protocol at TechFusion?" Ray blinked in surprise. "Yes, but that was another life." Victoria stood abruptly. "Marcus, have someone clean this up." She turned to Ray. "Mr. Mercer, bring your daughter and come with me." Ray hesitated, then lifted Sophie into his arms and followed Victoria into her office. The space was immaculate, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a spectacular nighttime view of the city. Victoria gestured toward a seating area. "Please, sit." Ray perched awkwardly on the edge of a leather sofa that probably cost more than his car. Sophie clung to him, sensing the gravity of the situation. Victoria studied them for a moment, then asked, "How does someone go from developing revolutionary financial technology to cleaning offices?" Ray's throat tightened. He rarely spoke about his past. "My wife was killed by a drunk driver 5 years ago. She was the business mind behind our startup. Without her, everything fell apart. I had a daughter to raise alone, and eventually, this was the job I could get." Victoria's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "And the payment protocol?" The intellectual property? Sold for pennies on the dollar to cover debts. Ray stroked Sophie's hair as her eyelids grew heavy. Why does it matter? Victoria walked to her desk and returned with a tablet. She tapped the screen and turned it toward Ray. On it was a complex diagram of Paragon's security infrastructure. We have a vulnerability here, here, and here, she said, pointing to different sections. Our engineers have been trying to patch it for months without success. Our competitor Nexus is exploiting these weaknesses to poach our clients. Ray studied the diagram. Despite 5 years away from the field, his mind immediately began identifying problems and solutions. Your encryption layer is outdated. And this authentication protocol. He stopped himself. I'm sorry. It's not my place. On the contrary, Victoria said. I think it might be exactly your place. She took the tablet back, considering him with new interest. Mr. Mercer, I have a proposition for you. ## a second chance. Victoria's proposal was simple yet life-changing. Ray would join Paragon's cybersecurity team as a consultant, working specifically on the vulnerabilities threatening the company. If his solutions proved effective, she would consider a permanent position. His first assignment: review the security infrastructure and present his recommendations at tomorrow's board meeting. I don't understand, Ray said, bewildered. You're offering me a job because I broke your model? I'm offering you a job because you just demonstrated 2 qualities I value highly: extraordinary reflexes and a willingness to put others before yourself. Victoria's gaze shifted briefly to Sophie, now sleeping against Ray's chest. And because your work at Tech Fusion was brilliant. We need that brilliance now. Ray hesitated. I have responsibilities. Sophie will be welcome in our corporate childcare center, which I'm ashamed to say I've never actually visited. Victoria's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. It's apparently award-winning. By midnight, Ray had signed temporary consulting paperwork and been granted access to Paragon's secure systems. Victoria arranged for a car to take him and Sophie home, with instructions to return at 7 a.m. As the luxury sedan pulled away from the building, Ray looked down at his sleeping daughter and whispered, "Things might be changing, princess." ## the presentation. Ray worked through the night, fueled by a combination of adrenaline and possibility. The familiar rhythm of coding came back to him like a forgotten language suddenly remembered. By dawn, he had identified 3 critical vulnerabilities and developed patches for each. More importantly, he'd outlined a comprehensive security overhaul that would not only fix current problems but prevent similar issues in the future. After dropping Sophie at the surprisingly wonderful corporate childcare center, complete with an indoor playground and qualified teachers, Ray found himself in a borrowed suit, waiting outside the boardroom where Victoria was introducing him to Paragon's executive team. Some of you may be wondering why I've invited a consultant to this critical meeting, he heard her say through the partially open door. The truth is, Paragon has been vulnerable for too long. Sometimes the solutions we need come from unexpected places. When Ray entered, 12 pairs of eyes turned to assess him. He recognized the strain in their expressions, the same desperation he'd felt watching his own company crumble. These weren't just corporate drones, they were people with families, responsibilities, futures hanging in the balance. Ray cleared his throat and began. Your security infrastructure isn't just compromised, it's fundamentally flawed. He connected his laptop to the presentation screen and showed them what he'd discovered. But there's good news. These vulnerabilities can be addressed, and quickly.